Good morning. Today is the 24th of Iyar, Tov Shin Pei Beis. Wednesday, the 24th of Iyar, Tov Shin Pei Beis. We are in Teres Menachem Sefer HaMamorim Tov Shin Yud Daled. We are in the first Mamar of the Sefer, of the book, the Mamar Zeh Hayom Tchilas Ma'asecha, of the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Was said on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, Tov Shin Yud Daled. And we are on page Vov, chapter 3. The questions the Rebbe asked were, we say in the Musaf prayer of Rosh Hashanah, Zeh Hayom Tchilas Ma'asecha Zikaron Yom Rishon, this day is the beginning of your actions, a commemoration for the first day of creation. And the two questions the Rebbe asked was, it's not the first day of creation, it's the sixth day of creation. Rosh Hashanah is on Aleph Tishrei. First day of creation was the 25th of Elul. So Aleph Tishrei is the sixth day of creation. That's number one. And it's also not the beginning of Hashem's actions. It's the sixth day of his actions. Right? And the second question that Rebbe asked was, if Rosh Hashanah is to be on the sixth day of creation, is to commemorate the beginning of creation, set Rosh Hashanah for the first day of creation. Why set it for the sixth day of creation? Those are the questions the Rebbe asked. The Rebbe explained that on Rosh Hashanah everything retracts to its original state. In other words, when Hashem created the world, it was his initiative, right? And Hashem created the world because he desired to be a king. And a king cannot be alone. A king, by definition, is over subjects who are separate. So that happened on the first Rosh Hashanah. The creative power of Hashem manifests itself through Malchus, through kingship. And that is and the Rebbe went into a lengthy discussion and lengthy explanation of the difference between Malchus as a full Sphira, full divine attributes, the last of the 10 divine attributes, and Malchus as it is within each one of the individual divine attributes, where in all of them, Malchus, in each of them, Malchus is the idea of concealing, regulating for the purpose of revealing, so to speak. But in terms of the individual Sefirot, the individual divine attributes, Malchus conceals, whereas a full divine attribute, Malchus removes. So the absence of the divine energies as a result of Malchus's function is quite different as it is so far as Malchus is as a full-blown Sphira in its own right, the tenth of all the divine attributes. And therefore what follows following Malchus, particularly because of the Parsa, if you remember that I mentioned that, because there's this barrier between the end of Atzilut, the end of the realm of emanation, going into Bri, Yitzir, and Asir, going into the domain of the created, what comes as a result is something which is completely separate, or appears to be completely separate from its source. And that's where you get subjects over whom to be king. Now, in order for that to take place, Hashem has to want to be a king, and he has to want to go through that process. So the first time on Rosh Hashanah, the first time when Hashem created the world, all the way back when, 5,780 years ago, he did it on his own initiative. From that point and forward, every Rosh Hashanah, everything retracts back to its original source, and we have to bring everything back down again and draw down a new divine energy in this process just described for the forthcoming year. That is accomplished through man. Man was created on the sixth day of creation. Hence, Rosh Hashanah is on the sixth day of creation. And that's why it's also called the beginning of your actions, because in fact, from that point and forward, that's when creation is reenacted, as it were, on the sixth day. So therefore, Zeh Hayom Tchilas Ma'asecha Zikaron Yom Rishon is actually a proper, authentic statement. So now the Rebbe says like this. In chapter 3, the Rebbe goes into another point of this process of recreating or redrawing, drawing down again Malchus on Rosh Hashanah. Now, up until this point, we spoke about kingship. But in order to be a king, Hashem has to want to be a king. You want something because it gives you pleasure, it gives you benefit or pleasure, right? So when we say Hashem wants to be a king, or we want Hashem to become king, it means we have to reignite. So in other words, what happens at Rosh Hashanah? Just the Malchus aspect retracts, or the fullness retracts? How great is the retraction prior to Rosh Hashanah, and what do we need to accomplish on Rosh Hashanah? So up until now, we just spoke about Malchus, kingship. But there's a lot more behind that exists. The desire to be king, the pleasure that it gives Hashem being king, and the pleasure that he gets from human beings recognizing him and serving him and so on and so forth. So that's what the Rebbe discusses in chapter 3. Gimel v'hinei. Hamshachas HaMalchus b'Rosh Hashanah hiloi rak b'negei le'inyan ha'melucha atzmai. The drawing down of kingship on Rosh Hashanah is not only in relation to kingship itself, el tzarich lahamshich gam es harotzen v'hatainug shebe'inyan ha'melucha. But we also need to draw down the rotzen, the desire, and the tainug, the pleasure, that there exists, that necessarily exists within kingship. What does that mean? The Rebbe describes what happens. V'hainu l'fisha b'Rosh Hashanah, because on Rosh Hashanah, and specifically, me'erev Rosh Hashanah ad achrit kiyas shofar, from the eve of Rosh Hashanah until after the blowing of the shofar, nasa hasiluk de pnimis hamalchus. What removal takes place? What retraction takes place? The inner dimension of Malchus. What does that mean, the inner dimension of Malchus? So the Rebbe explains. Ubiprotius in detail. What is the inner dimension of Malchus? In other words, what's the motivation behind kingship? What drives the kingship to exist, to be there? What drives one to engage in kingship? In detail, in more detail, this is the idea of the desire and the pleasure that there is within kingship. She is removed. She removes herself to her source, and the source of its source all the way back to Hashem's very essence. Right? So what happens on the eve of Rosh Hashanah? On the eve of Rosh Hashanah, not only Malchus retracts, not only the creative power, so to speak, is removed, but what was behind that creative power, what drives that creative power, in other words, the fullness, the whole spectrum of what is behind that Malchus and brings that Malchus into being, all retracts back to its original source, to the point where it is prior to Hashem creating the world, so to speak. In which case, of course, we have to understand how does the world exist until after Tkiyas Shofar. That's what I was going to address in a minute. But that's the idea. And what do we... So now, what type of retraction is this? V'siluk zeh, this retraction, this removal, it's not just like a concealment. Meaning, it just means that it's just not revealed, but it exists in a hidden way. Right? There could be something which is there, but hidden. Somebody hides, right? A parent hides from their child. So far as the child is concerned, he can't see the parent, but the parent is there, right? When we're talking about siluk, that's not the type of helam we're talking about. That's not the type of removal we're talking about. We're talking about... Is this yours?
Yes. Who found that?
I found it in the mikveh.
Thank you very much.
I think your glasses are on the sink.
No, not glasses. Thank you.
Page Vov, in the middle of chapter 3, we are...
How do you know it was mine?
I figured who has a ring and goes to the mikveh.
Thank you.
10 lines now.
6 from the top of the page, 10 lines, and from the beginning of the
Okay.
chapter, it's 6 lines. The line starts Eine Rakame Helem. So this retraction that takes place on Rosh Hashanah, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, where not only Malchus is retracted, but the Pnimius of Malchus, the entire spectrum of Malchus, the inner dimension of Malchus, retracts, everything retracts. It's not that it's present, but it's hidden. No, it's completely removed. It's as if that divine energy isn't there. What does it mean? It's like it isn't there, because obviously something is there, because otherwise everything disappears. If we're saying that Malchus is responsible for existence, so if Malchus is removed, what should happen to existence? It should cease to exist, right? So, but it's a complete removal, as if the divine energy isn't there, and then it fleshes it out. Okay, so just a few words by way of introduction. In the writings of the Arizal, it says that in the beginning of all, the Eir Ein Sof, Hashem's infinite light, filled the entire void. There was nothing besides Hashem's infinite light. And when Hashem decided that He wants to create the worlds, He contracted His divine energy to the sides. This is almost a verbatim translation. V'nishar cholol ha'makim, what remained was a hollow and an empty and a void in the middle. And then Hashem took a line, a kav, of divine energy from the infinite light, and He drew it into the hollow and the void. And that became the beginning. That is the process of creation. That is the beginning of the entire chain order of creation. The kav. That kav, that line of divine, infinite light of Hashem that He drew into this hollow and this void, in it is encapsulated the entire chain order of creation, and all that happens from there, it's just a myriad of descents and contractions, and which forms the entire structure, the entire structure of our Seder Hishtash, the chain order of creation.
Go through the spheres,
All the way, from the top, all the way to the end of creation.
And that was, so his intention was that he had to create the spheres in order to get down, but basically the covers had to be there in order to go through the spheres in the order they go in.
Correct. So in other words, what is the idea behind this imagery? That when before Hashem created the world, all there was Hashem and His infinite light. I don't want to go now into the nuances. There's Hashem's very essence, then there is His infinite light as it is included within Himself. It goes through stages. These are all before the contraction. This is called tzimtzum rishon. When we talk about Hashem contracting, He moved His divine energy to the infinite divine energy to the sides. That's called tzimtzum, the contraction. It's known as tzimtzum rishon, the first contraction. And it's called tzimtzum b'bchinas siluk. It's a removal in the form of, it's a contraction in the form of removal. In other words, not concealment. He didn't conceal the energy, He removed it. It's quite different when you say it's concealed, as I just said before. Concealed means it's there, it's just concealed.
So it's not creation, it's a removal of Himself.
It's before creation. It's the beginning of creation. What's the point? Let me just in brief explain the point. What's the idea? The purpose of this exercise that Hashem had to remove the divine energy, leave a hollow and a void, then draw the divine energy back. What's the point? The divine energy was there before. Why not remove the divine energy and leave the kav? Why do you have to remove everything, leave a hollow, and then draw the kav?
Why?
The answer is because Hashem could create without the tzimtzum. Hashem could have created, He could do what He likes, right? He could have left the kav and created and create and have the Seder Shtalshalos and so on and so forth. But what He wanted was that creation should appear ultimately and seem as if it's detached from Hashem. So the kav, if the kav would have remained, there would never be a situation where the Kav knows anything other than the connection to its source, to the divine energy. If you, so to speak, metaphorically remove the divine energy and you leave a hollow and a void, metaphorically speaking, and then you draw the Kav says, hang on a second, I'm coming into a foreign environment. I'm coming into an environment that is devoid of godliness. Right? So the Kav itself begins to reckon with the possibility, notionally, that there could possibly be, so to speak, separate existence other than Hashem's very essence and His infinite light. And that is the method Hashem chose for creation, so that we ultimately end up with a world like ours, which on the surface appears to be completely detached and devoid of Hashem. And it's only through delving in, thinking about it, and studying, and contemplating, and so on and so forth, that we actually begin to realize that it's not just, it exists. Like Avraham Avinu, who suddenly started contemplating and seeing and looking and said, hang on a second, there must be somebody that runs this show. But that all takes this idea that we feel ourselves, for example, as separate entities, naturally. Creatures feel themselves as separate entities. That is ultimately the result of the Tzimtzum Arishin, that initial removal, and the Kav coming back into an environment where, hang on, where's Hashem? Where's godliness? Right? Now, what the Rebbe is saying here is something very deep. He's saying the removal on Rosh Hashanah that takes place following creation is in a certain sense even greater than the removal of the Tzimtzum Arishin. The Tzimtzum Arishin is known, the first contraction that I just mentioned is known as Tzimtzum B'Bchinas Siluk. It's a contraction in the mode of removal, as opposed to Tzimtzum B'Bchinas Helem, or whatever the term is. Meaning to say that we have contractions all the way through Seder Shtalshelus. That's the chain order of creation. That's how we get from a higher level to a lower level. But generally, they're not as potent and not as strong and as in the removal sense as the first contraction. That's considered the mother of all contractions. Tzimtzum b'bchinas miyut. That's the expression. There's Tzimtzum b'bchinas siluk and Tzimtzum b'bchinas miyut. There's contraction in the mode of removal, and then there's a contraction in the mode of diminishing. So you diminish down the energy from before, but it's not removal. The first one is removal. The Rebbe here, what the Rebbe is going to say here is that on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, in a certain sense, the tzimtzum, the removal, is even greater than the first contraction, which is
Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah, until we blow shofar. That's what happens on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, and we have to draw it all back down. So let's see how the Rebbe fleshes it out. Yasna?
Yeah.
Clear? Huh?
So you're saying for that millisecond before we...
It's not a millisecond. It starts from the eve of Rosh Hashanah until after the blowing of the shofar.
Oh, so it's,
Yeah.
It's 24 hours.
Not 24.
Around
It would be, well, it depends when you blow shofar.
That's why you should get up early and blow the shofar early. Bring Hashem back in. That's the last.
Well, speaking of blowing the shofar, if I'm not mistaken, when there was the war between Russia and France, way back in the time of the Alter Rebbe, in this, when was it, 17, whenever it was? When Napoleon, 1820. That's when he started.
That's when
It ended, or whatever, that era, right?
Very good.
Wasn't that Pushkin's bar mitzvah?
exactly.
I remember that
He
year.
was born in 1790.
93. 97.
He's on it, this guy.
Who, if not him, who?
He's good.
Anyway, so there was a discussion among the tzaddikim at the time. What's better? What's better for the world? What's better for the Jewish people, and so on and so forth? And there were those that felt that Napoleon's emancipation policies and so on, freedom, etc. That's what should be supported. The Alter Rebbe was against it. The Alter Rebbe was a supporter of the Tsar. Not only a supporter spiritually, but he also utilized some of his chassidim to support the war effort and so on. Many interesting stories surrounding that entire episode. But it has been said that, and these were big tzaddikim, they carried spiritually a lot of weight. So how do you determine these things? So it was determined in Shemayim that whoever will blow shofar first on Rosh Hashanah, the one that he supports will win. And I think the two protagonists, so to speak, were the Alter Rebbe and Reb Shlomo of Karlin. Some say it was somebody else, but whatever. It was the Alter Rebbe and someone else. I believe it was Reb Shlomo of Karlin. when the Shlomo of Karlin came to blow shofar, at davening, when it came to blow shofar, he says, the Litvak hat nur ausgehabt. The Litvak already snatched it from me. He felt spiritually that the Alter Rebbe had already blown shofar. What was the story? The Alter Rebbe got up in the morning, made all his preparations for blowing shofar. It's not just blowing shofar. You can imagine when the Alter Rebbe blows shofar, or the Shlomo Karlin blows shofar, there's a whole situation going on in the spiritual realms. So what the Alter Rebbe did was he made all the necessary preparations for blowing the shofar. As soon he got up early, did whatever he had to do, and then he blew the shofar, and then he went to daven. So he blew the shofar before davening. So the Shlomo Karlin said that it's a done deal. And of course, as we know, ultimately, after very hairy battles, and he went all the way, he went very far in, but ultimately he was defeated. But that's the idea of shofar is a very powerful, it's not just you take a ram's horn and you blow. You could look at everything in that, in a superficial manner. It's like, well, what am I doing? I'm blowing the shofar, and that's responsible for drawing down Hashem's very essence into the entire world, and that brings existence for the forthcoming year and the energy and so on and so forth. It's what it represents, right? A lot of the rituals that we perform are images, if you will, or imagery and actions of something which is way, way, way greater than there's a lot. It's like an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is what we see is small, but the whole iceberg underneath is far greater. It's even more than that. It's infinitely greater than that. And it's only because Hashem gave it the power to be able to accomplish those things that it accomplishes those things. I think we'll leave it for today because we're going into a pretty hefty, weighty concept. But that's the idea that I was driving at. In other words, to understand what we accomplish on Rosh Hashanah and why it's Tchilas Masecha, that's the emphasis. Why indeed is it the beginning of creation? Because it's not only when you talk about the beginning, it's not a time issue. It's not a chronological issue. Beginning, it's the first day, the sixth day. What actually happens on Rosh Hashanah? We are recreating everything from its original source all the way back to the way it was before Hashem even thought about creating. And that's really the beginning. And that if that's what we do on Rosh Hashanah, then in that sense, it really and truly is the beginning. The fact that it happens on the sixth day of the original creation, that's neither here nor there really. That's almost irrelevant. Right? So that's the point that I was driving at. It's a very, very powerful and deep point, and hopefully we'll work our way through it and get a bit of at least a notional idea of what this is all about.